Now I'm going to show you a video that demonstrates just how quickly bacteria can evolve resistance to antibiotics.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
So a couple things I want to say about that video. It's a little bit misleading when it talks about the bacteria develop a mutation to allow it to go into the next field. Remember that organisms cannot just get a mutation that allows them to adapt. There has to be some variation in the population that allows 1 or 2 individual bacteria to continue to reproduce. So that variation has to be there ahead of time, but mutations upon mutations upon mutations will allow a species that starts out being sensitive to antibiotics to gain an extremely well-developed ability to be resistant to antibiotics, simply because their reproduction is so rapid and they can accumulate mutations quickly. A really great example of antibiotic resistance that we have seen has been in penicillin. Penicillin was used to treat injured individuals in the war that would help them fight off infections, especially if they had wounds in their limbs. For example, it would help people keep their limbs by reducing the amount of infection in them, and so they wouldn't have to amputate as much. So it did such a great job in saving troops that in 1942, penicillin was introduced to the general public as an antibiotic to stop infections for everyone, not just for the soldiers. It became available over the counter, and it was used at such a high rate and for pretty much everything, not just for bacterial infections. It was used at such a high rate that within 4 years after it was introduced to the general public, 14% of Staphylococcus bacteria, which are nasty bacteria that typically do respond to antibiotics, but 14% of them were resistant to penicillin in just 4 years after it was introduced to the public. And just 4 years after that, in 1950, 50% of staph strains were resistant to penicillin. You have probably heard of MRSA, which is another staph strain, and it has been exposed, and its ancestors have been exposed to so many different antibiotics that MRSA is resistant to almost any antibiotics that we throw at it now, and there's only 1 or 2 that are still effective against that staph type of infection. So this is a real problem, is antibiotic resistance of bacteria. Here are some important points to remember from that antibiotic resistance video. Natural selection does not create new traits, but it edits or selects for traits that are already present in the population. This is related to the caveat I gave you right after we watched the video. Also, evolution by natural selection can occur rapidly in species with short generation times, like these bacteria that we just saw. And again, the current local environment determines which traits will be selected for or selected against in any specific population. So in that example with the antibiotics, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, in the original plate with no antibiotics in it, there was no selection for antibiotic resistance, and so they grew really quickly. But as the local environment changed, certain strains were more selected as the places where the bacteria were entering had higher and higher levels of antibiotics. So in the last video, we're going to talk about indirect observations as scientific evidence for evolution.